The HOA president was crouched beside my work van with her phone held up like she was documenting a crime scene when I turned into my driveway and saw the fresh scrape running across the side panel. For a second, I thought somebody had hit my truck overnight and kept driving. Then she stood up, turned toward me without a trace of surprise, and smiled like she'd been expecting me. My name is Albert John. I'm 46 years old, and I'm a self-employed electrician living in a gated subdivision outside Mesa, Arizona. I've spent the last 15 years building my business one house call at a time, and that white service van in my driveway is how I make my living. If you've ever had an HOA cross a line you never thought they would, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. And if HOA neighborhood battles are your kind of drama, subscribe, because what started with parking complaints in my driveway turned into the ugliest fight I've ever had with a neighbor. The woman standing beside my van that morning was Linda Mercer, president of the Redstone Canyon HOA, and for nearly 2 months, Linda had made it her personal mission to make my life miserable. She lowered her phone and tucked it into her blazer pocket as I got out of the truck. "You're home early," she said, glancing at the scrape as if she'd just noticed it herself. "What happened to my van?" I asked. She tilted her head. Calm and polished, the same way she sounded every time she cited somebody for trash bins left out too long. "I wouldn't know. I was only taking photos for another violation report." Another violation report. That phrase had become routine ever since Linda decided my branded electrician van was ruining the neighborhood image. The van was parked in my own driveway, never on the street, never blocking sidewalks, never leaking oil. My company logo was printed on the side, Albert John Electrical Services, and according to the HOA handbook I'd signed when I bought the house 3 years earlier, commercial vehicles were permitted if they fit inside the driveway and weren't oversized. Mine fit with room to spare. Linda didn't care. The first complaint came 6 weeks earlier in a bright orange envelope taped to my front door. Unauthorized commercial vehicle presence visible from community roadway. I thought it had to be a mistake. I called the HOA office that same afternoon, and Linda answered personally. "Your vehicle qualifies as business advertising," she said. "It's my work van," I told her. "It's parked in my driveway. The rules say that's allowed." There was a pause, followed by the kind of tight laugh she used when she'd already decided she was right. "The board interprets visible commercial branding differently." "The board, or you?" "The board," she said, and hung up. I paid no attention to it at first. I sent in a copy of the bylaws section she was ignoring and expected the matter to disappear. Instead, the next week, another notice came, then another. Every Monday morning, like clockwork, there'd be a fresh complaint letter in my mailbox with photos of my van taken from different angles: front gate, sidewalk, across the cul-de-sac. It became obvious Linda herself was taking them. I'd spot her silver SUV creeping slowly past my house around sunrise, sometimes stopping just long enough for her phone camera to flash in the windshield reflection. At first I tried to stay calm. I work long days. Some mornings I leave before dawn for service calls across Maricopa County, and by the time I get home I'm carrying ladders, cable reels, and invoices. I didn't have time for petty neighborhood politics, but Linda kept escalating. By week 3, the warning letters became fines, $50. Then $100, then a notice threatening suspension of neighborhood privileges if I failed to remove the vehicle permanently. Neighborhood privileges, as if I'd lose sleep over access to the community pickleball court. Still, the fines mattered because they piled up fast, and Linda knew it. One evening I found her standing in my driveway waiting for me when I got home from rewiring a restaurant kitchen. She was holding a clipboard and wearing that same controlled smile. "You've now accumulated 3 unresolved violations," she said as I stepped out of the van. "You're citing me for something allowed in the bylaws. You're interpreting the bylaws selectively." "No," I said, pointing toward the folded copy in my shirt pocket, "I'm reading exactly what they say." She didn't even look. "Either the van is removed from sight, or the board may authorize towing from visible community areas." I stared at her. "This is private property, not exempt from association enforcement." That should have ended it, but the letter waiting in my mailbox the next morning changed everything. It was stamped final notice in red across the top. If the vehicle remained visible after Friday, enforcement action would begin. I drove straight to the HOA office after my first service appointment that day. The office sat near the subdivision entrance in a low adobe building with tinted windows and desert landscaping trimmed so precisely it looked artificial. Linda's nameplate was mounted on the reception desk as if she ran a corporation instead of a neighborhood board. She met me in the conference room with a folder already open. "I assume you're here about the violation escalation," she said. "I'm here because you're abusing your position." She folded her hands on the table. The board voted unanimously. "I want to see the vote record." "That's internal." "I want to see where the bylaw changed." "It hasn't changed." "Then show me where it says my van can't be parked there." For the first time, her expression tightened. She slid a printed photo across the table. "My van in my driveway at sunrise. The issue is aesthetic disruption." "That's not a rule." "It is when the board determines it affects property values." I pushed the photo back toward her. "You're making this up as you go." Her voice dropped lower. "Mr. John, if you continue resisting compliance, the board can impose additional penalties, including towing authorization." I leaned back in my chair and looked at her for a long moment. "This is personal, isn't it?" Her face hardened. "Excuse me? You pass my house every morning taking pictures. You filed every complaint yourself. Nobody else on this street has a problem with my van." She stood up abruptly. "This meeting is over." By then, I had already started noticing something else. My next-door neighbor Carl Benson had a landscaping trailer parked beside his garage every weekend. Across the street, a plumber kept a fully wrapped company pickup in plain sight. Neither of them had received a single violation notice. Linda was targeting only me, and I had no idea why. That Friday morning, I woke up before dawn to the sound of knocking on my front door. When I opened it, a tow truck was idling at the curb. Linda stood beside it in heels and sunglasses, holding paperwork. "You can't be serious," I said. "You were given notice. The vehicle is legal." "The board disagrees." The tow operator, a stocky man in a reflective vest, looked uncomfortable. "Sir, I just respond to dispatch." "You touched that van," I said, "and you're towing property from private residential land without legal authority." Linda stepped forward and handed me the document. It was a towing authorization form, but what caught my eye wasn't the signature, it was the date. The board approval listed on the paper was dated 2 days before the final notice had even been mailed, meaning the decision had already been made before I was ever given a chance to contest it. I looked up at Linda. "You approved this before the deadline expired." Her jaw tightened, but she said nothing. The tow driver shifted uneasily and lowered his clipboard. "I'm gonna need this verified before I hook anything up." Linda snapped toward him. "The authorization is valid." But he was already backing away toward his truck. "I'm not towing until legal clears it." He drove off, leaving Linda standing in my driveway, furious and humiliated. She turned to me with a look I hadn't seen before, not polished, not smug, but openly angry. "This isn't over, Albert." Then she got into her SUV and sped away. I thought that was her biggest mistake. I was wrong, because 3 days later, I walked outside before sunrise, saw that deep fresh scrape carved along the side of my van, and found Linda Mercer standing beside it with her phone in hand, pretending she had just arrived, and what I discovered on my dashcam that night would change everything. That morning, after Linda Mercer drove off from my driveway, I stood beside my van staring at the scrape until the Arizona sun cleared the rooftops. It ran nearly 3 feet along the passenger side panel, deep enough to cut through paint and primer, right across my company logo, Albert John Electrical Services. My business name looked like somebody had dragged a knife straight through it. For a moment I just stood there in silence, keys still in my hand, feeling that slow kind of anger. That doesn't flare up all at once, it settles into your chest and hardens there. Because that van wasn't just transportation, it was my livelihood. Every estimate I carried, every ladder rack I'd installed, every tool drawer in the back, every service call that paid my mortgage, it all depended on that vehicle, and now it looked vandalized. I canceled my first appointment of the day and climbed into the driver's seat, pulling the dashcam memory card from the front unit mounted beneath the windshield. I'd installed that camera a year earlier after somebody sideswiped me in a grocery store parking lot and denied responsibility. Since then, I'd left it running any time the van was parked. I carried the card inside, loaded it into my laptop at the kitchen table, and pulled up the overnight footage. At first there was nothing unusual, hours of still darkness, porch lights across the street flicking off one by one, a coyote crossing the cul-de-sac around 2:17 a.m., then at 5:42 that morning, Linda Mercer's silver SUV rolled into frame and stopped directly beside my driveway. My hand froze on the trackpad. She stepped out wearing the same blazer she had on when I arrived home. In one hand was her phone, in the other was a long metal object I recognized instantly, a folding car key. She walked calmly to the passenger side of my van, glanced once toward my front porch, then dragged the key straight down the side panel in one deliberate motion. Not an accident, not incidental contact, a full, intentional scrape. Then she stepped back, examined the damage, raised her phone, and began taking violation photos like she was documenting evidence against me. I replayed it 3 times, each viewing made it worse, the calmness of it, the certainty. The way she looked completely comfortable damaging somebody else's property in broad daylight because she believed nobody could stop her. That should have been enough for me to march straight to the police station, but I didn't, not yet, because I knew Linda, and I knew exactly what she would do. She'd deny it, she'd claim the footage was unclear, she'd accuse me of editing it, and somewhere in the middle of all that, the HOA board, the same board she controlled, would circle around her and bury the whole thing behind procedure. If I was going to bring Linda down, I needed more than outrage, I needed timing. That same afternoon, another envelope appeared in my mailbox. This one contained a new violation notice: vehicle exterior damage creating neighborhood blight conditions. Repair required within 72 hours or additional penalties apply. I laughed out loud when I read it, a short, disbelieving laugh that echoed in my empty kitchen. She had vandalized my van herself, then fined me for the damage. That was the moment I understood how far she was willing to go, and it also gave me something I hadn't had before: proof of intent. I put the notice in a folder with every complaint letter she'd sent me over the last 6 weeks. Then I printed still images from the dashcam video and placed those in the same file. By evening, I had a full paper trail spread across my dining room table: weekly citations, escalating fines, the forged early towing authorization, and now video evidence of deliberate vandalism. But before I could decide my next move, Linda made hers. The next morning, I came home from an emergency generator repair call to find 3 people standing in front of my house: Linda, a uniformed private security officer hired by the HOA, and Carl Benson, my next-door neighbor, standing awkwardly in his slippers beside his mailbox. Linda turned as I parked at the curb. "Mr. John," she called sharply, "your continued refusal to comply has forced immediate board action." I stepped out slowly. "What now?" She held up a clipboard. "You caused that damage." Her face remained expressionless. "That's a serious accusation." "I have it on video." For the first time, something flickered in her eyes, not guilt, alarm, only for a second, but I saw it. Then she recovered. "If such a video exists," she said coolly, "I suggest you present it through proper channels instead of making threats in public." Carl straightened up beside us. "Wait," he said. "You have footage of somebody scratching your van?" "I do." Linda snapped toward him. "This matter does not concern neighboring residents." Carl frowned. "It concerns me if HOA dues are paying for this circus." That should have ended the confrontation right there. But Linda had already overplayed her hand. She handed the security officer the clipboard and pointed toward my van, photographed the violation for enforcement records. The officer hesitated. "Ma'am, if there's an active vandalism dispute, shouldn't we wait?" Linda's voice sharpened. "Take the photographs." He reluctantly raised his phone. I took one step closer and said loudly enough for Carl and the officer to hear, "Go ahead. Make sure you capture the damage Linda Mercer caused herself at 5:42 yesterday morning." Silence. Even the security officer lowered his phone. Linda's face turned pale, then rigid. "You're attempting intimidation," she said. "No," I replied. "I'm documenting truth." She spun on her heel and walked back to her SUV without another word, but the damage to her confidence was visible. For the first time since this began, Linda Mercer had lost control of the scene. Carl waited until she drove off before stepping closer. You really have video? I do. He gave a slow nod, then don't sit on it too long. People on this street already think she's abusing her position. That caught my attention, people. Carl glanced around before lowering his voice. You're not the first homeowner she's targeted. Just the first one pushing back. I stared at him. What do you mean? He hesitated, then said, last year she forced a retired couple on Desert Bloom Lane to repaint their garage twice over made-up violations. They moved out 3 months later. That stayed with me long after Carl went back inside, because until then, I had seen Linda as a personal bully. Now I was beginning to understand she was something worse, a pattern. That night, I received an email from the HOA board announcing an emergency compliance hearing scheduled for Thursday evening. Mandatory attendance required. Failure to appear may result in immediate enforcement lien action. Linda had called a formal board hearing, and if I knew her, she intended to bury me in public before I had the chance to expose her. I almost smiled reading it, because she had no idea what I was bringing with me. Still, one question kept bothering me. Why had she become obsessed with my van in the first place? The answer came unexpectedly the next morning. I was loading conduit reels into the back of the truck when Carl crossed over from his driveway carrying a folded real estate flyer. You need to see this, he said. The flyer showed a glossy advertisement for a luxury home listing 2 streets over. At the bottom was the realtor's name, Mercer Premier Realty, Linda Mercer's family business. Carl tapped the page. She's been trying to attract higher-end buyers into Redstone Canyon. Heard her say at last month's board meeting that visible work vehicles make the neighborhood look blue-collar transitional. I looked from the flyer to my van, then back again. There it was, the real reason. This had never been about bylaws, never about rules. Linda wanted my work truck gone because to her, it made the neighborhood look less expensive. She wasn't enforcing standards. She was trying to erase people like me from the image she wanted to sell, and that changed everything, because now I didn't just have evidence of vandalism. I had motive. Thursday night's emergency hearing was less than 48 hours away, and by then, Linda Mercer was planning to make an example out of me in front of the entire board. What she didn't know was that before that meeting even began, someone else on that board was about to see the footage she thought would never leave my driveway. Thursday night, I arrived at the Redstone Canyon HOA board office 15 minutes early with my evidence folder under one arm and my laptop bag over my shoulder. The hearing room was smaller than I expected, just a long conference table, 6 board chairs, and a row of folding seats along the wall for homeowners. Carl was already there in the back row. Arms crossed, giving me a quiet nod when I walked in. Linda Mercer sat at the head of the table in a navy blazer, her posture stiff and composed, but the second her eyes landed on my laptop bag, I saw the tension in her jaw. She knew, not everything, but enough to understand that I had come prepared. 2 other board members were present, Diane Holloway, the board secretary, and Mark Ellis, the treasurer. Neither of them looked comfortable. They shuffled papers without meeting my eyes. Linda opened the meeting with the same polished tone she always used in her notices. This emergency compliance hearing concerns repeated refusal by homeowner Albert John to remedy ongoing commercial vehicle violations and resulting property degradation. Property degradation, she said it while sitting 3 feet from the person who caused it. She began reading through my violation history, stacking the orange notices in front of her like evidence in a trial she had already decided. Then she slid forward the newest photo, the one showing the scrape along my van. This visible damage, she said, has now worsened the aesthetic impact and, I agree, I interrupted. The person who caused it should be held responsible. Linda stopped mid-sentence, her eyes locked on mine. This is not the time for accusations. It's exactly the time. I opened my laptop, turned it toward the board, and pressed play. The room went silent, the dashcam footage filled the screen. Linda's silver SUV rolled into frame, Linda stepping out, Linda dragging her key down the side of my van, Linda taking photos of the damage she had just created. No one spoke for several seconds after the clip ended. Diane Holloway's face drained of color. Mark Ellis leaned back in his chair and removed his glasses like he needed to make sure he had really seen what he just saw. Linda stood up so abruptly her chair scraped against the floor. this footage is manipulated, she snapped. It's time-stamped and unedited, I said. And I've already made backup copies. Carl spoke from the back row, I'd like that entered into the meeting record. Linda turned sharply toward him. This is a closed board proceeding. Diane finally found her voice. No, she said quietly, staring at the screen. Not anymore. That was the moment the power in the room shifted. Mark reached for the towing authorization form I had included in my evidence packet. What is this date discrepancy? He asked, holding it up. This approval was signed before the final notice expired. Linda said nothing. He looked at her again, harder this time. Did you authorize towing before board review? Still nothing. Then Diane opened the violation file stack and began flipping through the notices. All of these complaints were filed under your direct submission code, she said. Linda's calm mask finally cracked. I was protecting property values, she said sharply. Somebody had to enforce standards. By vandalizing a homeowner's vehicle. Mark said, her voice rose, that van has been an eyesore since he moved in. The room froze again, because now she had admitted the one thing she had tried to hide. This had never been enforcement, it had been personal bias. Diane pushed back from the table and stood. I'm calling for immediate suspension of Linda Mercer's board authority pending formal review. Mark nodded without hesitation, seconded. Linda stared at both of them in disbelief. You can't do this. But she was wrong, because for the first time, the board was no longer following her lead, and as Diane reached for the official suspension form, Linda realized the hearing she had called to destroy me had become the moment her own control over Redstone Canyon began collapsing. Linda Mercer stayed standing for a moment after Diane called for her suspension, like she expected someone in that room to rescue her authority simply because she had worn it for so long. No one did. Mark signed the suspension form first, then Diane. The private security officer Linda had ordered around earlier that week stepped in from the hallway after being called by the receptionist. And for the first time since I'd known her, Linda was the one being asked to surrender something, her board access badge, her office keys. Even then, she tried to keep control of the room. This is temporary, she said, gathering her papers with trembling hands. You're making a mistake based on incomplete facts. Diane answered her without emotion. The footage is complete enough. Linda looked at me then, and there was no smugness left in her face, only anger mixed with disbelief that someone she had dismissed as beneath her had become the reason she was losing everything she had built inside that HOA. She walked out without another word. The door closed behind her, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any argument we'd had in the previous 2 months. Then Mark turned to me. Mr. John, he said, all violation notices connected to your vehicle are hereby suspended pending full review. Suspended? I asked. Diane shook her head and corrected him. Cancelled. Effective immediately. She pulled the stack of orange notices toward her, stamped each one void across the front, and slid them into a separate file. Just like that, 6 weeks of harassment disappeared into a dead folder. But it didn't end there. Over the next 10 days, the board launched an internal review of every complaint Linda had filed over the previous year. What they found was worse than even Carl had suspected. Dozens of selective violations had been issued without proper board approval. Multiple homeowners had been fined under rule interpretations never formally adopted. 3 towing threats, including mine, had been initiated before vote deadlines expired, and every single one traced back to Linda. At the special community meeting the following Tuesday, the hearing room was packed tighter than I had ever seen it. Word had spread fast. Homeowners who had stayed quiet for months finally had proof that the person policing the neighborhood had been operating like it was her private kingdom. Diane read the findings aloud in front of the full association. Then came the final vote. Linda Mercer was permanently removed as HOA president by unanimous board decision. She was also barred from holding any board role in Redstone Canyon for the next 5 years. The room didn't erupt into applause. It wasn't that kind of crowd, but there was something stronger than applause in that silence: relief. The kind people feel when someone who has abused power can no longer hide behind procedure. A week later, I received formal written notice that every fine against me had been erased, and the HOA would reimburse the repair cost for the damage to my van through their liability insurer while they pursued civil recovery from Linda directly. My truck went into the body shop the next Monday. when I picked it up 3 days later, the scratch was gone, and my company logo looked new again, for the first time in weeks. I parked in my driveway without wondering who might be watching from behind tinted glass. Carl came over that evening while I was unloading wire spools from the back. "Neighborhood feels different already," he said. He was right, the slow patrols past my house stopped. The sunrise photo ambushes stopped, and suddenly, other work vehicles started appearing openly in driveways all over Redstone Canyon: landscapers, plumbers, pest control vans, painting contractors. Turns out I had never been the only one hiding from Linda's idea of what the neighborhood should look like. About a month later, I saw Linda one last time. She was clearing out framed certificates from the HOA office near the front gate while a maintenance worker held the door open. She glanced at me as I drove past. No wave, no smile, no accusation, just a quick look from someone who had finally run out of authority. I kept driving, because by then, I understood something I hadn't at the start of all this. People like Linda count on silence more than rules. They depend on the assumption that ordinary people will back down rather than challenge paperwork, titles, and threats dressed up as policy. What she never expected was that the same dashcam she ignored in my windshield would become the proof that ended her control. And every morning now, when I pull my repaired van into that same driveway, I park it in full view of the street, exactly where it belongs. What would you have done if your HOA pushed things this far? Tell me in the comments, and don't forget to share where you're watching from, and subscribe for more unbelievable neighborhood battles where bullies always pick the wrong house.